want money nothing, but I'm going deep, 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 deep.
Hey guys, welcome to Old Average Brit Gaming Goes In Depth. What does in depth mean? This is going to be a series of videos where I discuss particular units, all their stat lines, what's the best way to use them, what's the best way to kill them, and any quirks or any funness that can go with that particular unit in your army. This series is primarily going to focus on the Thousand Sons and also Tzeentch demons, and that's two of the big armies that I'm working on at the moment. They work side by side quite well, and I'm going to be discussing all of those units over a series of videos. So let's get into the first unit. In this video we are going in depth with Magnus the Red, the Daemon Primarch of the Thousand Sons. So what better way to kick off this brand new series than with the Primarch himself? Let's start at the top and try and work our way down. So starting at the basics then, Magnus the Red is available in the Index Chaos at the moment, as there is no Thousand Sons Chaos Codex. That should be coming, if rumours are to be believed, before Christmas 2017. In the meantime, we have to work with the Index. And starting off with the basics then, Magnus is 415 points and a power level of 21. That exceeds a lot of the larger tanks. And so is pretty powerful. So you're going to expect mega stats with this guy. Magnus is a Lord of War choice. So you only have two detachments where he can fit in. The first one being the super heavy auxiliary detachment, which is just a single Lord of War. No command benefits or restrictions other than the fact that it's got to be a Lord of War, so he can fit in there. And secondly, the Supreme Command detachment. Now, this has a compulsory choice of 3 HQs, but then an optional choice of 1 Lord of War or 1 Elite's choice. And from that you can gain 1 extra command point. So you need to rock in 3 HQs and a Lord of War, in this case Magnus, in order to fit him into your detachment. So his stat line then, he has a weapon skill of 2+, a ballistic skill of 2+, strength 8, toughness 7, rocking in with 18 wounds, a leadership of 10 and a save of 3+. And because he has so many wounds, as he takes damage, his stat line does degrade on the movement attacks and also a psychic phase buff. So at 10 to 18 wounds, he has a move of 16 inches, 7 attacks, and a +2 bonus to his psychic phase. At 5 to 9 wounds, he has a move of 14 inches, 6 attacks, and a +1 to his psychic phase. And when he's really battered, at 1 to 4 wounds, he has a move of 12 inches, 5 attacks, and no psychic buff. So as you can see, even when he is degraded, he's still pretty potent. He can still move pretty quick, he still rocks a lot of attacks, and bearing in mind how powerful his melee weapon is, which we'll cover a bit later on in the video, he's still a force to be reckoned with, even when he's down to just his last wound. So let's move into his abilities then. The first ability he has is Death to the False Emperor. Now this is common across all Heretic Astartes units, and basically means if you roll a 6 to hit in the fight phase and you're fighting an Imperium keyworded enemy unit, any of those 6s generate an additional attack against the same unit with the same weapon. So if you're fighting Imperial Space Marines, Imperial Guard, any of that kind of stuff, you know, Legio Custodes or anything like that, any 6s to hit in combat, you're going to get an extra attack. His second ability then is Crown of the Crimson King. Now that basically means he has a 4-up invulnerable save. This is quite common against most characters and most leaders of any of the factions at the moment. Pretty much all characters these days that lead an army have a 4+ invulnerable save, so that's quite a common thing. But in this particular case it's known as Crown of the Crimson King. His third ability then is Gaze of Magnus. Now being a Psyker, which there are many of in the 40k universe, but if you're up on your Warhammer 40k fluff, you'll know that Magnus is one of the most potent Psykers in the background. And in 8th edition, all Psykers know the Smite Psychic Power. Traditionally, this is cast on a 5+, and will inflict D3 mortal wounds to your nearest enemy unit. If you cast it on a 10 or more, that will inflict D6 mortal wounds to the nearest enemy unit. However, being super powered and supercharged that Magnus is, with the warp running through his veins, that power is actually doubled. So he inflicts D6 mortal wounds on a 5+, or 2d6 mortal wounds on a 10 or more. Why is that particularly relevant for this guy? Well, as I mentioned earlier, he has a psychic buff whilst he is not completely depleted of wounds. So between 10 and 18 wounds, he has a 2+ to cast. That means he's actually smiting on a 3+ and causing d6 mortal wounds. But for 2d6 mortal wounds, he's actually casting that now on an 8 or more. An 8 is a lot easier to get than 10. Conversely though, that means he has more chance of Perils of the Warp. His final ability then is Primarch of the Thousand Suns. Now this is split into 2 parts. The first is a reroll of 1 to hit for all Thousand Suns units within 9 inches of Magnus the Red. The second half of that is invulnerable saving throws of a 1 made for friendly Thousand Suns units within 9 inches get to be re-rolled as well. And your note on that then, this is the buff to fellow Thousand Suns units only. This isn't an aura ability that casts over to Heretic Astartes units. So you have to be a Thousand Suns keyword model. And right now that's pretty limited. You are limited really to Magnus himself because his aura includes himself, Ahriman, Exalted Sorcerers, Zangors, Rubric Marines and Scarab Occult Terminators. As mentioned then, Magnus is a Psyker, which really isn't unsurprising if you're a fan of the Thousand Suns because, you know, they are Psykers pretty much across the board. Magnus though, he has the ability to cast and deny 3 psychic powers in every psychic phase. So in the friendly psychic phase he can cast 3 powers, and in the enemy psychic phase he can attempt to deny the witch against 3 other powers. As is standard with Psykers, as I mentioned, he knows the Smite psychic power, but 3 others from the Dark Hereticus discipline. Now the Chaos Index only has 3 powers in their Dark Hereticus list. However, the Chaos Space Marine Codex actually has 6 plus a bonus for the Mark of Tzeentch. So if you want to use those extra psychic powers for Magnus the Red, or indeed any of the other Psykers within your Thousand Suns collection, then this is definitely worth looking at. There's 2 ways to get hold of these powers. One is to buy the Chaos Space Marine cards, the deck of cards that you can get with those, or buy the Codex, and that gives you access to those extra powers. And I highly recommend, if you're going to be using Magnus or any of the Psykers, that these extra powers are definitely worth it compared to the base ones that come in the index. Finally, let's discuss his faction keywords. He has faction keyword of Chaos, Tzeentch, Heretic Astartes and Thousand Suns, and an individual keyword section of Character, Monster, Demon, Primarch, Fly, Psyker, and of course his name, Magnus the Red. So let's move into his powers that he has access to then, the Dark Hereticus powers. So the first one then, as all Psykers do, they know Smite. Smite has a casting value of 5, which I've already mentioned, and causes d6 mortal wounds if you're Magnus, and 2d6 mortal wounds on a 10+. Bear in mind, remember, Magnus has these buff bonuses for his casting ability, so whilst undamaged, and I'll refer to most of these as undamaged, he's actually causing d6 mortal wounds on a casting value of 3 and 2d6 on a casting value of 8, which is very achievable on good dice. The second one he has access to is Infernal Gaze. Now Infernal Gaze has a casting value of just 5 again, so in effect for Magnus he's casting this on a 3-up. And this is an enemy visible unit, so you don't have to be the nearest enemy unit, unlike Smite, and you roll 3d6. Each of those dice, if it comes up with a 4+ on each of the dice, then the target suffers another mortal wound. Good thing about that Infernal Gaze then is it doesn't have to target the nearest enemy unit, which is what Smite's limitation is. The third power he has access to is Death Hex. Now Death Hex is a charge value of 8 this time, so it is actually the highest one in the discipline. But for Magnus, that means he's casting it on a 6 whilst undamaged, so highly achievable again. And if manifested, an enemy visible unit within 12 inches of the Psyker, until the start of the next psychic phase, that unit cannot take invulnerable saves. Now, this is very similar to the Space Marine Null Zone version. So ripping invulnerable saves off of the enemy units is pretty good, so that's what Death Hex does. Let's move on to the next one then. This is Gift of Chaos. This has a warp charge of 6, and Magnus is casting this typically on a 4+. And if manifested, you simply select an enemy visible model within 6 inches, so it's quite a low range one, and you roll a d6. If the result is greater than the target's toughness, it suffers d3 plus 3 mortal wounds. So you'll notice a lot of these are kicking out a lot of mortal wounds straight away. If it's a character slain by that power, you generate a Chaos Spawn and replace the enemy character with that Chaos Spawn. Now, characters in 8th edition have all been given quite a lot of wounds these days. You know, typically around about sort of the 4 or 5 wound mark for most sort of standard leader type characters. But the majority of anything with an awful lot of wounds is going to be quite tough as well. So trying to roll a single dice to try and beat toughness is quite difficult. So the first thing this does remove is the ability to try and hit vehicles with it. Vehicles are all, as far as I'm aware, nothing below a toughness of 6. So you can't roll more than a 6. You can't roll above a 6 with a single dice, so you're not going to be able to affect vehicles. Now, picking out enemy characters or enemy models that have that toughness. Many models that have a character and a lot of wounds are going to be around the toughness 4 mark. So actually you've only got sort of a 1 in 3 chance of actually making this work, as you've got to exceed the toughness. So you need to roll a 5 or a 6 against most average characters these days to inflict those wounds. So for me, not the best power in the world, but it does inflict a lot of damage if you can pull it off. But I think there's better ways to pick powers for Magnus the Red in this list. Let's move into the next power then, which is Prescience. Prescience has made a return. That was in 7th edition. But Prescience in this one has a charge value of 7. If manifested, you select one of your friendly Heretic Astartes units, which is quite convenient because that's obviously going to be a keyword across all the Thousand Suns, within 18 inches, so it's quite a big range of the Psyker, and then you add 1 to all hit rolls. Now, Chaos Space Marines or Heretic Astartes units normally have a ballistic skill of 3+. And if you're running a pure Thousand Suns army, your typical target here is going to be Rubric Marines or Scarab Occult Terminators. So you're going to be increasing their hit potential by 1 to hit ground targets on a 2+. Also gives you a good chance or a better chance of hitting flyers, which have special rules, which means they're a -1 to hit. So you can negate some of those odds to hit flyers. So it's a very, very good power. Next up then is Diabolic Strength. This has a warp charge of 6, and then you simply select another friendly Heretic Astartes unit within 12 inches, so quite a good range again. And until the start of the next psychic phase, you add 2 to that model's strength and 1 to its attacks characteristic. Finally, in the main Dark Hereticus discipline, we have Warp Time. Warp Time was again in the previous editions, but has a warp charge of value of 6, so Magnus is casting this on a 4. And if manifested, you pick a Heretic Astartes unit within 3 inches of that Psyker, so it's quite a low range one, and that unit can immediately move as if it was its own movement phase again. You can only use it once on a unit. You can't chain warp times together, which would be a little bit broken, but being low range, it's quite difficult to get off on other units. But 3 inches is obviously in range of himself, so warp time on Magnus is pretty damn good. Finally, if you have the Mark of Tzeentch, you can have the Weaver of Fate psychic ability. This has a warp charge value of 6, and if manifested, you select a visible Tzeentch Heretic Astartes model or unit. So there's quite a number of keywords in there really, so you need to be Tzeentch and Heretic Astartes, which pretty much limits you to 1,000 Suns. And it has a range of 18 inches from that Psyker, so again, a really big range. And until the start of the next psychic phase, you add 1 to any invulnerable saves. Alternatively, you can actually increase a model that doesn't have an invulnerable save to gain a 5+ invulnerable save. So that actually breaks down into 2 things. First is add 1 to an invulnerable save, and the second one is to grant an invulnerable save. Now, looking through all of the rules of Thousand Suns models that have Tzeentch Heretic Astartes as their keywords, every model already comes with invulnerable save, so gaining the invulnerable save if you didn't have one is actually completely pointless because it doesn't exist. Araman, for example, has a 4+ invulnerable save. Rubric Marines have a 5+, Scarab Occult have a 5+, even Zangors have a 5+ invulnerable save, so you can't actually gain an invulnerable save if you already have one. However, the most important part of here is you add +1 to any invulnerable save that you have. Where this does come into effect though is if you're running a hybrid army of Chaos Space Marines as well as Thousand Suns pure models. So if you're running a regular squad of Chaos Space Marines, for example, they can take a Mark of Tzeentch. They will by nature have Heretic Astartes, therefore you can give a squad of Space Marines with that mark. They aren't Rubric Marines as such, but you can give them an invulnerable save. Works on things like Havocs and Demon Princes and other models there that can take an optional mark as well as have that Heretic Astartes keyword. So which ones are going to be best for Magnus himself then, to actually carry himself? He gets to pick 3 powers, and including the smite, for himself. So there's a couple here that stick out that are no good to actually use on him in his first place. So whether he carries them or can use them again with other units, this is where we need to make some decisions. So to actually use them on himself, there's a couple that are really quite poor. So the first one is Prescience. Add 1 to his hit roll. Now he doesn't have a ranged weapon, so that completely blows that out the water. And he already re-rolls 1s to hit in the first place for melee, for combat, in the fight phase. Now with a weapon skill of 2+, he's already hitting everything on a 2. And then in case he does roll a 1, you get to re-roll that anyway. So Prescience does absolutely nothing for him. So complete waste of time to be casting Prescience on Magnus himself. The next one I have mixed opinions with, and that's Diabolic Strength. To use Diabolic Strength on Magnus gains +2 strength and an extra attack. What's useful here is the +1 attack. Magnus with 8 attacks, hitting on 2s with a reroll on those 1s, can really ruin someone's day. But the +2 strength, he's already strength 8 by basic, but his Blade of Magnus, which I'm going to discuss after the psychic phase, is double strength. So he's already up to strength 16. So anything that is toughness 8 or below, he's going to be wounding on 2+. There are very few units in the game that are toughness 9. So the reality is +2 strength isn't actually going to do a huge amount for him in most games and against most targets. Toughness 8 and below, he's going to be wounding on 2s. The +1 attack is useful, but he's already rocking 7 attacks. So whether that extra +1 attack is going to benefit him hugely or just be overkill and wasted hits and a wasted power and effect is something I am conflicted with. But in most cases I think Diabolic Strength on him is actually not going to be that well regarded. It's not going to be needed. Everything else though I think has real valid abilities on Magnus himself. So Infernal Gaze, anything that causes mortal wounds is always good in this game these days. Mortals cannot be stopped by most armies. There are a few bits and pieces that can stop it, but the more you kick out, the better it's going to be for you. Death Hex, that certainly has some benefits. Ignoring enemy invulnerable saves is pretty good. There's a lot of models out there these days with invulnerable saves, certainly a lot of enemy characters, Terminators and so on. So being able to shred off those invulnerable saves is going to be a good thing. Gift of Chaos. As I said when I was explaining the Dark Hereticus powers, for me it's a bit of a 50-50. It's easy to cast, it can easily cause wounds, but 1 dice to beat enemy toughness. It's a 1 in 3 chance. For me, given that you've only got 3 powers to pick from, probably the weaker of the remaining ones that are going to be any good to him. Final one then is Warp Time. Warp Time gives you an extra movement in the psychic phase. Now, when you've got a 16-inch movement and then you cast this on yourself, you are gaining a 32-inch movement. That's rather epic and gets you across the board pretty damn quick. Add into the fact that a 2d6 charge into the enemy lines can give you a potential move and charge 32 plus 12, 44 inches across the board. That is huge. 44 inches gets you pretty much anywhere you need to be very quickly. The other big thing about Warp Time is that you can use it, because it's in the psychic phase, it means that you don't need to fall back to get out of combat. So if, for example, you find yourself in a combat that's with a tar pit type unit that sat you in there, and if you fall back out of combat, he doesn't have the ability to then recharge another unit. However, he can just simply go, you know what, I've had enough of this combat, I'm going to Warp Time, cast that on a 4+, because it's 6+ is 2 buff, and he can then just bugger off and go elsewhere and then charge something else. He could even charge the unit that he was stuck in, which would mean that he'd get to go first in combat. Lots of really cool tricks with Warp Time, especially when you have such a massive move. Now Warp Time's really cool even when he's degraded as well. Even when he's down to 14 or 12 inches, the that extra movement is pretty damn good. Probably the most important power then is left to discuss, and that is the bonus one for Tzeentch Heretic Astartes, and that's Weaver of Fates. Weaver of Fates giving you that +1 to your invulnerable save. For Magnus, who has a 4+ invulnerable save by the Crown of the Crimson King, means that he's now going to rock a 3+ invulnerable save, and with the Primarch of the Thousand Suns rule means he's getting to reroll ones of a failed invulnerable save. Now, given the nature of the weapons that are going to be targeting this guy, he's probably going to be using his vulnerable save more than his regular save. And in fact, his invulnerable save then becomes as good as his regular save, only with the Primarch special rule of rerolling ones becomes that much more powerful. So, for me, Weaver of Fates cast on himself is absolutely essential. So let's talk about his melee weapon then, the Blade of Magnus. Blade of Magnus is a melee weapon. It has a strength of ×2, so in effect this is a strength 16 melee weapon. Has an AP or rend value of -4 and causes a flat 3 damage per wound. So as mentioned before, he has a 7 attacks basic, hitting on 2s, and because of that whopping strength he's going to be mostly wounding pretty much every other model on the board, also on a 2. With an AP of -4, most models are not going to get a regular armor save against him. They may get invulnerable saves, but AP -4 is huge. So unless you've got a 2+ save, you're going to get nothing against it. And if you're a multi-wound model, you're going to be pretty dead pretty quick. So if he hits and wounds with every single one of his close combat attacks, he's going to kick out 21 wounds. That's enough to rip most tanks off the board, and certainly pretty much any enemy infantry model. Really ideal against those tough elite models, things like Necron Destroyers, which have 3 wounds, things like Terminators, which have 2 wounds. He's going to absolutely rinse those to pieces. This is one of the reasons why I don't think having that Diabolic Strength with the +1 attack is always needed. If you can kick out 21 wounds on top of your Psychic Phase, now bear in mind your Psychic Phase, you have the ability to potentially cause 2d6 mortal wounds from Smite and 3 from Infernal Gaze. He can kick out 15 mortal wounds before he's even into combat. So that extra +1 attack might be worth it only when he's degraded and still wants to be super powerful. But at that point, if he's that degraded, you're probably going to be either winning the game or the game is going to be over because Magnus has just rolled so badly that he's already dead. So kicking out that much power in melee combat will kill pretty much any tank, certainly kill any enemy characters. And if you combine that also with Death Hex, if you're worried about the enemy having a good invulnerable save, cast Death Hex on them first, that'll remove that invulnerable save, and then you're just going to cause all that damage from melee. One of the best melee weapons in 8th edition, without a doubt. So if you're playing against this Super Magnus the Red character, what's his weaknesses? How are you going to kill him? Well, there's a couple of big vulnerabilities that he has, right? So the first one is that he's a character with more than 10 wounds, which means he can be shot at. Magnus has 18 wounds, and is therefore going to be a prime target for those high damage weapons like Last Cannons, Dark Lances, Bright Lances, heavy weapons on flyers like Multi-Melters and so on that can easily get in range. And you can just, pound him with all those high damage weapons. If you're going first against Magnus, he has only a 4+ invulnerable save to prevent any of that damage going through. If the enemy can block your invulnerable save in any way, shape or form, like Null Zone or any other equivalent, and lose that, those weapons are all going to be hitting on their regular ballistic skill and all wounding on 3s and then causing a flat d6 damage. And you'll soon get through those 18 wounds. He has no way of blocking mortal wounds, and he has no way of moving any wounds onto alternative characters. There's no sort of bodyguard, there's no Death Shroud Terminators or anything like that to say, you know what, you've hit me, but I'm gonna chin those wounds onto someone else. He's going to take it all himself, and if he's going second in the game and you can alpha strike him off the board, that's 415 points and all those psychic powers removed from play. That's what you're going to be targeting. He is exceptionally difficult to hide on deployment, so line of sight on most tables is not going to prevent Magnus being shot at. I've not seen any tables that can prevent this size of model being hidden completely, so given a little bit of movement or whatever to get that good line of sight, he's never going to get anything decent from cover. So those big weapons with the big range are certainly going to cause lots of damage. Even if you remove half of his wounds to get him down to sort of a lower movement and lower attacks and lower psychic buff, he is then very vulnerable. Secondly, like all models, he is vulnerable to mortal wounds. There are a few exceptions, things like disgustingly resilient and a few other feel no pain type effects. He doesn't have that. So any mortal wounds you can get on him are going to rip him to pieces as well. Now he does have his psychic deny the witch abilities, so he can try and block these, but there are ways to cause him some pain. I played a game recently where I put Magnus in quite a vulnerable position of 2 weird boys from an orc army. Their psychic buffs were even better than Magnus's when they are surrounded by boys, and he took 11 mortal wounds from a single psychic phase from 2 weird boys. So that's his 2 vulnerabilities. If you're going to go first, shoot him with all your high damage weapons. He can't hide from you. That's the key. So now we've covered his weaknesses, how are you going to use him as a Thousand Sons player or someone who's simply taking Magnus the Red in their army? So one of the big things he has is the fly keyword. Yes, that means he can rip planes out of the sky. Typical flyers have between 10 and 14 wounds. He can take those out with just 4 or 5 hits from his melee weapon, and he should get that easily enough. Even more so is if you smite the planes first. Aircraft don't have a 2+ save in most cases. I've not seen a 2+ save yet. So they're not getting any regular saves from his attack because he's rend of -4. And with his speed, combined with warp time if you need it, can easily reach pretty much any aircraft on the board. So he's great for taking out flyers. In general melee, he's also going to cause lots of problems, any multi-wound models. As I mentioned, Terminators, Necron Destroyers, that kind of thing with 2 to 3 wounds. He'll crush in a single round of combat. Typically they're taken in a unit of sort of 5 or 6 maybe. He's easily going to hit and wound all of those and then smash them off the board. Getting bogged down in those swarm units is never ideal, but remember that little warp time trick I mentioned earlier? You can easily bail out and assault again next turn just using some warp time. Tank hunting, very similar with planes. Given that he can inflict sort of, up to 21 wounds just in melee, he makes for a great tin opener. So high value enemy tanks is a great way to do it. So super heavy tanks, for example, he can really pack a punch and rip those apart. Key thing though is picking your targets well. With a potential output of 15 mortal wounds and 24 damage if you include that bonus attack from Diabolic Strength, for example. Maybe he's not carrying it, but maybe a friendly Psyker is carrying that, so an Exalted Sorcerer casting it on him. He can kick out potentially 39 wounds. That's pretty much anything on the board. So consider your target priority when you use him. Smite one way, charge another way, multi-charge if you can. He's got a big enough base to support that kind of strategy. And he can multi-kill several units. Magnus Rage. Remember that Magnus has a potential 32-inch move and a 12-inch charge, giving that 44 inches in a single turn. Okay, your average is going to be around 39 inches, but that's enough to reach most enemy models on the board. Slinging him forward, letting him rip the enemy open to shreds, and see if he can hold the own may seem a bit reckless, but it can be fun to try. Certainly if you get him off with a 3+ invulnerable save, and once he's in, into that area, then drop a unit of Scarab Terminators nearby. Adding Warp Time and Diabolic Strength on those puts those in an easily comfortable chargeable range, with lots of strength and added attacks. Diabolic Strength on Scarab Occult Terminators with their power weapons puts them up to Strength 6 with 3 attacks each. They have a -3 rend as well, so if you feel the battle's going well and Magnus is still at full power, switch the +1 invulnerable save to those Terminators. They then get a 4+ invulnerable save, plus all the Diabolic Strength as well, and there's some really tasty returns on your combat and your melee phase. Big question then is, should you use him in your army? At 2,000 points, I certainly think he's a viable choice. Anything less than that, I'd probably consider alternatives. If you lost him in a game at 1,500 points, you're losing almost a third of your force, and probably that's the heart of your offensive capabilities and manoeuvrability. Thousand Sons are very, very slow. He is super quick. So, for me, 2,000 points, yes. Probably below that, not so much. As an alternative, you could run things like 2 Demon Princes with Malefic Talons. That comes in at a similar points value. They're about 180 points each. They might lack that psychic offense, but the melee abilities more than make up for it. Demon Princes have 7 attacks with Malefic Talons. They can easily rip flyers apart as well. but I'll cover those in a future in-depth video. But if you want that psychic punch and you don't want to run Magnus, Aramon is the obvious choice. But again, 2 Exalted Sorcerers are pretty potent as well. So there we go, that's Magnus in depth. This video is obviously quite long because Magnus is a Primarch, so future in-depth videos should be a little bit shorter. But there's a lot to cover with Magnus. He's got a lot of abilities, and the psychic might of Magnus is not to be missed. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, like and subscribe, and I shall catch you on the next video.